Back in the studio here at the Engine Performance Expo, Joe Castello, Randy Neal from CWT, and the video with Mike, incredible because he said something that I truly do believe to be true, which is if you do something you love, you'll never work a day in your life. And he joins us now, Mr. Mike Moran. Mike, welcome. Thank you for joining us here on Engine Performance Expo.
Oh, thank you for having me. I just regret that I can't make it there in person, but maybe for the next one.
Well, exactly, and we would appreciate that. I know you've got some interesting things that you're going to talk about. You and Randy going to kind of go a little bit more in depth. Before we do that, though, I just want to compliment you on something that I thought was really worthwhile. The cleanliness of the shop, like going out of your way, over the top to build an environment where your guys come in, feel great, have like a positive attitude about going to work. It's not that people don't want to have that, but the way you emphasized it, I think that's a great lesson.
Yeah, I think my guys are good enough that they don't have to come into a really nice place, but it really doesn't hurt. It really gives it an attitude that's positive throughout the whole day, and it's worth it to have a guy that's full time that just makes it that way.
Awesome. All right, so what are we going to learn about here today?
What was the question?
Oh, we were going to dive in more deeply into a certain topic. Obviously, Randy is an expert when it comes to balancing, and we're going to try to bring your knowledge out there to our viewing audience right now. So let's get some people tuned up out there.
Okay, what are we going to talk about? Which part?
Well, let's start off with engine balancing, as we've got Randy here, and he's been making some waves over the past couple of days about the bad news of a bad balanced engine. So let's start there.
Well, balancing actually has linkage to anything that rotates. And with the turbos now, this is a different animal altogether. Like we talked at 10,000, 11,000 RPM. Listen, that's idle speed for turbos. That's nothing. You guys are out there to 80,000, 90,000, 100,000. And so where we start becoming involved is that you've learned how to design the turbine blades so that they're efficient. You've learned the process of design. Where we're at on the backside is looking at the durability and stability of those. So let me just catch on with this real quick. People don't understand because of those surface speeds. I'll give you just an example. We talk about a gram in automotive balancing applications. Look, we talk about 1,000th of a gram in application of the turbo. Even that, and I'll go back to that 1 gram for a minute. You got to understand that your RPMs, you're generating forces in exceeding of over 1,400 pounds, and it's hitting at 13,000 plus times per second. I want you to understand this pounding effect. Now, at some point, something's got to yield. So the design guys are out there doing these things with the turbos. God, I'm impressed. The power adding effect is amazing. But you have to live. You don't build grenades. What was the saying we heard the other day? You can't tune something that blows up. Well, you got to go back to this gig, and you got to be very clear. It's got to live. Now, one thing about it, the housings themselves are almost acting like bell houses or scatter shields, the way we used to treat them. But the forces that we're generating now, and I'm watching some of these explosions sort of spin off to some of the things I see on the internet. I got to tell you right up front, I'm entertained by these explosions. But this is taking it to a level that I'm trying to actually look at and say, guys, you're over center here. You need to pull it back. So this is where balancing comes into turbos. Okay, but let's get back to how the performance of it. And Mike, you actually have relayed the applications of advantages of the design. Can you elaborate a little more on that?
Just to reiterate a little bit on what you were saying, Randy, it's some of the stuff that you don't see actually in the race car stuff. The balancing, if you're just slightly off, it's going to magnify. For example, usually when a car is on the starting line and it's on the chip, it's turning probably about 12 to 20,000 RPM on the actual shaft speed. And we cause a misfire to actually build boost, to speed the wheel up, to accelerate it. Now, that's okay at low speed, but when the car's in high gear and you're at like 50 to 70 pounds of boost, you're going to see anywhere from 80 to 120,000 RPM on the shaft speed. If the thing misfires for any reason on the top end, and the balancing's not exact, you're going to see a dramatic change in RPM. And if a guy was to pull his turbocharger out like we have and looked in the exhaust housing, you're going to see where that wheel started wobbling and touching off and causing damage. But most guys have never taken it that far. But I was in a couple situations where in the early years, the balancing wasn't as exact as it is today. And it would commonly touch off if there was any trouble on the pick end. And by touching off, a lot of times you would cause damage to the compressor housing as well, because it'd want to spin backwards and back off the actual shaft. So in the early years, there was a lot of that. And it just shows what a great part it is in the balancing to be exact. It just has to be able to tolerate, misfires in top end. And if it's not perfectly balanced, it's going to oscillate even worse.
Right.
Well, I was going to say, in terms of identifying a new market, innovating and sticking with it, as you have with the turbochargers, just kind of watching through the video, and it wasn't easy in those early days. You're talking about EFI and turbos and how they work together and how the evolution of both have kind of enabled both to excel, and that there are very few people that would even bother to try anything without electronic fuel injection. But talk about the bulldogged nature, if you will, of embracing the turbocharger technology and sticking with it to this conclusion where you're now a leader and successful, and now this is something that, every kid I know aspires to have a turbo on his car, not the way it was when I grew up.
Yeah, the early years, it was more or less taking a turbocharger that was designed for something else in the OE, whether it be diesel, gasoline, whatever it was. And then racers like myself and it was a small few people that were trying to do it, and you were trying to use a part that was designed for something else, so there was a lot of pitfalls along the way. But it was about analyzing what was going on, reporting back to people in the industry like Harry Haruska or the guys over at Garrett. If you report back to them and give them the feedback, then they could actually start understanding what had to be done. But it was an evolution, right? So we're going back 15 years, probably more like 18, 20 years ago now that I think about it. And if you just look at what it was then to get a car to spool up versus now, you'd swear that it's night and day. Before, you used to have to use all kinds of tricks, spool valves, dump the transmission converter pressure. Nowadays, it's almost nothing to get one to spool up, and it's still evolving as we speak. It's every couple of years, it's amazing what is gained by it, but it's really a treat compared to what it was 20 years ago. I got to tell you, because we were trying every trick in the book. There was a lot of sacrifices on back pressure to get it to spool up. You were doing every trick in the book. Nowadays, you just got to be able to tune the keyboard and bring it to you, and it's relatively easy nowadays.
Let me pick up on what he just said, though. This is one of the key functions of this whole show we're doing. Listen, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, last year, things are changing. They're moving. Technology is our friend. We got to understand this. But yet there's a little balance here. I have a little fun with this because I'm watching, again, I watch some of the YouTube stuff, and these guys are taking them right over the cliff. I mean, they're blowing them up, and they're laughing about it. And I got to tell you, my guys who watch this, I say, some of those guys, they're a little over center here. They're not very bright boys. Well, maybe I went too far. I'm going to hell for that statement. But what I'm going to simply say is that you got to appreciate that's not the goal to blow it up. The goal is to improve. So we do this through the art or the science, the math, and these are available to us now. This is not 20 years ago where we just spitballed our way through it. Buddy, this is a science, and the industry needs to sign on.
Mike, your thoughts on there are people who do things with car parts for entertainment, and there are people who do things with car parts for competition and success. You're obviously that, with all these great milestones. Like I'll watch something like that, but definitely would never emulate and pay to do something like that. If I'm paying, I want it to live, and you've been able to do that. You've had so many great milestones, Mike, with the streetcar going into the fives, for instance, being embraced by television. Was any of that on your radar when you first got started in this, or were you just like a car guy who was interested in achieving more horsepower?
That's a really good question. I guess the best way I could sum that up is I was always a car guy in the beginning, and I was into nitrous in the beginning, and it's still a great combination. But in 1986, I started getting into turbochargers, and in '87, I bought a Grand National, which comes stock with a turbo, and it was amazing the potential I was seeing in it. And the whole time that I was actually racing competitive nitrous classes, I was looking at this turbocharger on the street and thinking, this ought to be a really good deal if we could actually get the right components together in one of these race engines. And that's kind of how it all started for me. It was more of a fun hobby in a car that I bought, and I saw the potential right away. And it was probably late '80s when I started actually building motors with turbos for racing, and it was probably coming into the 2000 that before we actually started using it and trying to develop it.
Who were some of your influences during that period? Like you mentioned the Grand National, which we saw in the background in the video. First of all, I'm curious, is that the same one? And second of all, I can think of some of the early pioneers with turbochargers and drag racing. I think about Buddy Ingersoll, etc.
Oh yeah.
Who influenced you and helped drive you forward to decide, like, hey man, I'm gonna do this even though very few other people are?
That's a really good question as well. I had a few people in the industry that I deal with on a regular basis in my racing, and I could think of John Meany was a big influence with Big Stuff EFI, because we were always talking turbochargers all the time. Kenny Duttweiler was a good friend. You could call him and chit chat with him about the Buicks and the stuff we were doing in the late '80s. Harry Haruska, Precision Turbo. I think I could sum it up with about those people there that were actually a big influence in what we were doing. We were fast and in our nitrous application and sought after to go to turbos, and it wasn't a hard sell. I was constantly in contact with all these people that I just mentioned, and I had some working knowledge of it. So it was not short thereafter that we actually started doing it and running it on the track. And I think they contributed the most to the influence of where I went with my racing and the turbochargers.
Listening to you and watching the evolution of your thought process and how you've evolved the product, pretty cool. Bottom line, but
thank you.
Well, listen, you've done it, guy. You just flat made your place in history. But take me into the future now. Where do you see us a little bit as we're going through? Look, we need to bring the young in. We need to go ahead and prop up our guys for the next level. What's your feeling on that? How do we go forward from here?
Well, it's going to be an evolution. It might be a little bit slower than I'd like to see it. Of course, I'd like to go full bore at something, but keeping in mind that the guys on the other end that are doing the actual turbochargers and the balancing, like yourself, they got to keep the safety in mind. Us racers, we just want to go forward at light speed, and I just keep wanting to develop more things. But they're the ones actually trying to do containment and in a worst case scenario and what ifs, right? So they're the ones that keep us in check and say, here, we'll give you a little bit this year, we'll give you a little next year. I think they're still not, I still think there's some gains to be made on the turbine side, on the exhaust side. Who knows? They may actually enter in the variable vane stuff like what they've got in the OE, like you see in the diesel trucks nowadays. That could enter in. They'd have to overcome the RPM thing, because the shaft speeds are a lot higher in what we do than what the diesel stuff do. But nothing's impossible. Never say never. That's what I've learned. And I think that the materials, they may come up with another material that can take the heat. I mean, if you can get rid of some weight, some mass, but still maintain the aerodynamics that they're looking for on the exhaust side, that could be a big improvement. But again, the aftermarket is going to focus on keeping us racers safe. So it's always a constant push. I'm pushing, saying, what if, why can't we do this? And then it goes to the engineers at the divisions that are making this stuff, and they got to say, this will work, that might not work. And it's just going to be an evolution over the next, who knows, 5-10 years. I'd like to say that we make as much progress as we have in the last 5 or 10 behind us. So I think it's just a thing where we're going to have to wait and see. But I got high hopes that it's going to be much better 5 years from now.
Let me build on that just for a second, because the growth, or I should say, the way we're moving, the technology is an exponential deal. This is not a sliding scale. Look, the way that we're running this thing now is fun, number one, exciting, and it drives our future. Bottom line, the technology is the answer here. So if we can take this roller coaster and sort of keep this thing moving along, we'll have a lot of fun, but more importantly, we're going to improve.
I agree.
So, in terms of, you just said something that kind of sparked me a little bit. We were talking about people who are influences, and now we're looking to the future. Where do you look for future inspiration? I don't want you to reveal what your next big secret is, obviously, but I would like to know the direction. Like, certainly big power, drivability. Those were a couple of things that I don't know that everybody realized people would want. And when I say big power, 2,000 horsepower street cars that'll go 20,000 miles and be reliable. Like, I don't think that was on the radar of too many people not that long ago. What do you think is possible, and what do you want to be possible? We're talking about OEs, and I watch Formula One. Obviously, there's been pretty amazing things. WJ yesterday talking about 52% efficiency and some of the stuff that they're able to do. So, what do you watch? Where do you look? Where do you search when you're looking for that inspiration of what's possible that maybe you can apply to your cars?
Well, when it comes to street cars, that's two different things, I think. When it comes to street cars, I want the most I can get. And I think the customers that I deal with on a daily basis want the same thing. And it was uncommon to see 2,000 horsepower, 10 or 15 years ago on the street. Now it's almost commonplace. Now 3,000 horse is the new number for streetability and drivability. I think that 20,000 miles is something that we do commonly. We've got at least a dozen customers that have that kind of mileage out of a 2,000 horsepower engine, whether it's a Generation 2 Hemi or a big block Chevy. As long as you can create a good enough cooling system in the car, that's commonplace. If a guy wanted to pump the power up to actually get on race day for a racetrack, then it's a different motor. I think that the streetability goes away with the higher lifts and the fast-acting lobes, if you will, because it's actually a real fast ramp on a lobe is very detrimental to the lifters and the valve train. So then you take away your drivability and your 20,000 miles. Then you're into about 5 races, 10 races before you're in there, doing replacement on lifters or rebuild on lifters or doing the valve train. So I guess who I would look to for inspiration is probably my customers. They keep coming to me with new situations, and I want to do this. What do you think? And, all I can do is say that, this is what we've done in the past. I'd like to move that direction, but here's what we'll do. We'll do this, right? So it's just like anything else. My customers are always bringing new situations to me that I'm trying to conquer and move ahead on, and it's, so far I don't see no end in sight. There's always somebody wanting more on the street. So typically right now, probably the most we got, is probably 2,500 to 2,800 on the street nowadays. That wouldn't be like a drag week type car, because we could make over 3,000 pretty easy with that. But the longevity is about 1,200 to 1,500 miles, and most of these guys don't want to pull them apart every year, because some of my customers are putting 5,000 to 6,000 miles a year on them, driving them. So, but to sum it up, I think that the inspiration is coming from my customers. They're always wanting more, and they're always coming to me to design them something from scratch, and we love doing that stuff.
Look, the interesting part of what you just said, and I'm very much in agreement with you. But if you look at the diversity of the turbo market, listen, Grandma's car's got 3 turbos on it now. And when we keep playing with this thing, look, there's turbos on weed whackers, for Christ's sake. This thing's just going in every direction you can think of. This is just, this segment of engine growth within the scope of turbos, unlimited. Absolutely unlimited. It's an exponential. Actually, I don't know if there's things higher than exponential, but let's just simply say it's a positive direction.
I'd like to reiterate on that as well, Randy. I think that something I wanted to touch on was a lot of things in the 90s and the 80s. Us racers were actually basing what the OE does, and we were taking that technology and trying to take it farther. I think in the 2000s, I think we've seen a reversal of that. I think turbos got so popular after guys like myself and a handful of others started running them, and the buzz started getting so big that the OE was looking at what we were doing. And the next thing you know, the Grand National wasn't the only thing in production with turbos. The next thing you know, pickup trucks got them.
Yep.
I think it really created a huge buzz. It was like overnight after the 90s. It just seemed like all the OEs were looking at turbochargers for their needs.
Look, it's a no-brainer gig. If you sit there and you're trying to fight against it, you're going to lose this fight. It's over. I mean, when I say grandma's car, I'm talking, look, it could boost, I don't care which way you want to go with this thing. Turbos are just there. It's great stuff.
Well, on that note, I think about myself as my dad, young hot rodder, early 80s. What do? We go buy a cam, an intake manifold, and a carburetor, right? Now we're hot rodders. Yeah, we made more power. There are people in that position now who want to do something and would love to get involved with turbocharging, but maybe it's more intimidating. I'd love for you to speak to those people who are would love to be involved. It's definitely a cool, hot, modern setup. They don't want to do something old school. They want to do something current. But it does seem to be a little more intimidating. There's a lot more going on. How would you recommend someone get involved? Maybe their first turbo combination.
That's an excellent question. I've been asked that type of stuff before, and I'll tell you the same thing I tell them. Turbochargers in general, you shouldn't be afraid of the turbocharger technology. Even if you don't know what you're doing and you put a turbocharger on something that isn't built for turbos, if you kept the boost moderate and 10 pounds or so, I could throw a dart at a board of camshafts and it wouldn't matter which one it hit. It's still going to make really good power. Would it be optimum? No, but you'd be so far ahead to do something like that. It would be unbelievable. So I think that, it's not the turbocharger you should be afraid of. It was what I think everybody is afraid of is the EFI. With that being said, EFI nowadays is so mainstream. Back in the 80s, I was the only one running it. People were laughing at me. They were pointing, saying that I should get a weight break because I have EFI. And it wasn't shortly thereafter before I started getting it figured out that those same people were signing petitions to put weight on me. So that's the evolution of racing, right? So nowadays, versus back then EFI was like a secret password thing. Nobody knew it. It's like new black magic stuff. But nowadays, the software guys are writing this stuff so intuitively that anybody that knows how to even use Windows, let's say, it's very intuitive. It's just easier to use nowadays. So it's not like you got to know all the little niches and nuances. Nowadays, it's straightforward. The people doing it know that it's the average Joe, and if you can use a computer and its basic knowledge, then you can use EFI. You might not know quite what air fuel to run, but that's where guys like me come in. That my customers get a full class on it when they buy EFI from me. But as far as using the software, it's gotten much easier to use in the later years, and it's just still going. It's crazy. Every year, I'm just thinking when I see something, I'm like, why didn't they do that back then? It's so much easier to use. And the self-learning, they got a lot of them that are self-learning. I like to joke around about that. It's self-learning. You give it parameters, so it's not so much self-learning as it is actually just following your parameters and your commands. You just got to know what needs to go in there for a parameter. It's like 4 basic parameters, and then it can do the math for you, and then you look at it. So it's come full circle from where it was back in the 80s. It's much easier to use, almost much easier as it was for carburetors changing jets. So you just need to deal with the right person on your initial purchase, and they can instruct you on all the things that you got to pay attention to, and it's not that bad. So I really encourage people to jump in with that. The carburetor thing is a thing of the past 40 years ago, so it's really something they should look forward to and not be afraid of.
That's a great statement. How about we move into some Q&A here a little bit? Let's see how this is going to work for us.
Sure.
Absolutely. All you folks out there, put your questions in the chat section, and we'll read them for Mike. This has been great, and I know we got a lot of questions out there. Gary, for instance, he's got a 10.2 compression engine, and so talk a little bit about compression. How much is too much for turbo, and what is right?
That's a little bit harder to talk about. I don't mind it, but over the years I've developed an overall compression ratio with boost. Okay, so I've got a spreadsheet in my computer. It's not to bore you with that, but if you're doing a street engine, the lower compression gives you a bigger window. So say 9-to-1. Let's just say 9-to-1. The lower compression gives you a bigger tuning window that you don't have to be an expert tuner. So if you're at 9-to-1 or 8-to-1, it's very unlikely that you're going to hurt it. If you start putting compression in it, 10's fine. How much boost do you want to run? It works out that 10 pounds of boost is good for 10-to-1, 10.5-to-1. The tuning window gets a little bit narrower, but if you go with the lower compression for a street guy, and he gets some 87 octane instead of 93s, he's going to have a bigger window of success. So I think that the 10-to-1 is okay as long as you're not going to run over 20 pounds of boost and you're decent at tuning and know your fuel that you're putting in. There's a lot of factors that play into that, but 10-to-1's not bad. 10.5-to-1, that's okay as long as you got decent gas and you're not trying to exceed 20 pounds of boost. Got it.
Kenny wants to know, in terms of design and tech, what's made a bigger difference, if there is one or the other, in turbocharger technology? Design or materials? Has the design evolved further, or have the materials involved been the reason we've seen such a step forward in performance?
Well, that's a good question, and I would say, bar none, that the design is the biggest thing. Right. Design and the aerodynamics of the blade. They're looking at how much air it can push versus how much force it puts back. Then they're looking at area over radius and the exhaust housing to create that turn, right? So the design is the biggest thing, for sure, no doubt. The advent of the billet wheels, the CNC design stuff, it's really been huge. We were dealing with cast compressor wheels back in the 80s, and now it's nothing to have something whipped up in CAD, then run it through a finite analysis and make sure that it's not going to come apart. Then you go to trying it. So the design is everything. That's everything. The material has always been Inconel on the exhaust side, and that's what I'd like to see in the next 10 years. If they could come up with a lighter material that's something that can hold up. So they've come a little ways with the material, but the design has been the biggest by far. Hopefully that answers your question.
Excellent, and thank you for the question. We've got viewers from Belgium out there, just to continue filling out the globe. This one for Randy: does CWT sell a turbo balancer?
Well, yeah. Well, listen, if it rotates, I build a machine to balance it, period. But let's be very, very clear that one of the things that we link up is not just building a machine, we link up with technology. When we talk about design changes, what he just hit on, listen, that's everything. When you take these wheels and you develop such a unique profile, you also go back and challenge structural integrity. And then at speed, these things change shape. Now, I got to tell you, when they change shape, it's not generally positive. Weird things start showing up. But balancing can catch a lot of that, and especially in our high-speed balancers, by the way.
Excellent. This one from Richard. Mike, have you or your company ever worked on turbocharged engines for racing aircraft?
Well, that's a really good question, too. I do have an aircraft background. That's where I came from in my early years. I was racing and aircraft mechanic, by night. So I always looked at that technology that was going on, but I didn't really apply the turbo side of it in my early days of racing. I was just admiring it. I think that I've never done anything with an aircraft. I've just looked at it from afar. There's a lot of liability when it comes to aircraft. It would have to be a private, plane, something for pleasure. But it's something that you really got to be careful when you're putting passengers on something that I've been approached. I ain't going to say that I haven't been approached, but just from a liability standpoint, you don't have a bad day in an aircraft and then come away okay. It's one of those things where a race car conks out on the side of the road. I might have a customer mad that it didn't work out, but he's still my customer. So I've never done anything with an aircraft engine as far as turbocharger. I've just been admiring it from afar from my experience.
Excellent. Greg has a question. Turbos are often referred to as free horsepower since they use waste gases. Is that horsepower really free, or does the exhaust restriction posed by the turbos create its own issues?
Well, I can tell you some of my past experiences. The term free power means that, you've got 70% of the engine's horsepower going out the exhaust pipe. What we're doing is just harnessing that power and using it to turn another device. It's not free, but it is definitely cheap. I'm going to put it that way.
Right.
I can tell you that some of the forced induction stuff that I've ran on the dyno was amazing. That the pickup it got. I could just think of one just last year. I had a 302 for a customer, and he came in with a supercharger, and we ran it. We were experiencing belt slip, and we were fighting to get the belt to stop slipping, and we finally achieved that with the right tensioner. There was a lot of things involved, and I think the motor made 780 horse at 20 pounds of boost. It was a 302. Then the customer agreed that maybe we should try turbochargers, and I just happened to have a couple small 62-wheel turbos sitting around, and we had a set of headers that fit a 302, and like a couple days later we had the stuff bolted on, and we ran it at 20 pounds of boost. So, for example, 780 horse, 760 is what we made. I remember it now with the supercharged application. That same engine, the same everything, with 20 pounds of boost, made 1,070. So hopefully that gives you an idea of what the difference was versus something that's driven off the crank versus something that's utilizing the power going out the pipe to run something else. So I wouldn't say it's free, but it is very cheap.
Got it. Ken says good morning to everyone, depending on where we are. Question is, can you use too big of a waste gate and blow-off valve? So talk about the relationship of size with that to your turbo.
Well, let's talk about the wastegate first. I don't know that you can do too big of a wastegate. I don't think I've ever had that happen. But you can use too small of a wastegate. If you do too small of a wastegate, you can't get control of turbine speed. You need to be able to dump that energy feeding it, right? So I don't think anybody's made one too big. I haven't tried a 65 millimeter on a 4-cylinder engine, for example, but I got to believe that I think that would work. It's just a matter of it's a linear actuation of opening the wastegate. So it's either going to go open a little or a lot. But if you have one too small and it opens all the way and it's not enough, then yours is too small. So I think the exhaust side of it, I think you'd be okay. I don't think you could get too big on there. But it would get into a packaging issue. So you'd have to decide that yourself if there was something you could fit a bigger wastegate in. The blow-off side I usually do, I'm mostly into racing and I don't use blow-offs. The blow-offs were designed for superchargers and they're used in OE commonly for turbos. And my opinion is that the OE wants their vehicle to last 130,000 miles, and without the blow-off, you're putting load on the backside of the turbine or on the backside of the compressor when you let off the throttle, and then that boost has to have someplace to go. It's trying to escape out the front of the compressor. That prematurely wears the bearings. Do I think that they're okay? Yeah, but in the racing world, for what I do, we're counting ounces in the car, and to add like 5 pounds worth of blow-offs is not something we're going to do. We're going to, eliminate that factor. although I have used blow-offs in a controlled situation to control starting line boost. But as years have progressed, the turbos, like we were talking earlier, have advanced so much that I almost don't need them anymore. Again, that's going to be a personal preference. My personal preference is I don't use blow-offs because I don't need to go 100,000 miles on my race engine. So I'm just looking to count weight. But the exhaust side of it, I think bigger's better. I don't think they make too big a one on the market yet today. Hopefully that answers your question.
Great questions. Thank you to everybody. Couple more. I'm going to kind of fuse a few questions together. People asking about EFI systems. One, like which modern EFI system is most dummy proof, and more specifically, what is your preferred EFI system?
Well, I'm partial to Big Stuff 3. I've been friends with John Meany since I think 1985. So we've been together for a long time. And I'll be honest with you, it was the only game in town back in the day. I mean, it was just, there wasn't anything else. So as of the last 5 or 10 years, I'm just going to say the last 5 to 7 years, it's been unbelievable how EFI companies are popping up everywhere. It's becoming so mainstream that everybody makes an EFI system nowadays. And not necessarily that any of them are bad. I think all of them got the right idea. John led the way with this since the mid to early 80s. And I think that my preferred system is Big Stuff because I do all the development work with John on our dyno at our shop, and I get to say what happens on a lot of it, and then he gives me the other side of it. So I think we've worked really good together putting a system together that the racers like, whereas some of these other systems, they may be more tech-based, and maybe they didn't get the influence of a racer or an end user. But I gotta say, all the systems out there right now are pretty good. But of course, I'm partial to what I'm using now. But I can't say that I would say that there's any of them out there that I would steer you away from. It's just whoever you're working with and what they know. Okay.
All right. So Mike is. We're obviously testing for the future, getting a little bit of a peek at Pat Musey coming on. Mike getting cut off for a quick second. Randy actually getting a shout out in our comment section. Shout out to Mr. Randy for being an awesome supporter for the industry. Came out when we got our CWT balancer and personally trained us. So that is kind of cool. And so you're even getting shout outs in the Q&A.
Listen, the check's in the mail. Thanks for that.
There it is. Mike, are you back? Because I have one final question for you.
I'm here.
Oh, that's great. Someone wants to know what's up with the new billet clean sheet engine. Anything new?
With my designed engine, you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. I've been in development with that over the years, and I've been running it on the dyno at least once a year. But as you can imagine, there's really not much time to do my own stuff. So that's I slide that in every now and then. I've come a ways with the valve train. I'm not quite there yet. I'm hoping this next year in the spring I can run it one more time with the new design valve train. I've been working closely with Jessel and Danny, and then some camshaft people. But currently we're at about 5,600 horsepower. And I see that we're going to have the potential to probably break 6,000, but I've got to get past some of these issues at higher RPM. I'm, with anything new that hasn't been done, obviously there's some pitfalls that I got to work through, but I'm also unable to stay on it for very long. I get about 1 week a year, I get to mess with it, and then I go back to redesigning some parts, and then I wait for those to come in. So I'm hoping that this year might be the final year I'm ready to release it to a couple customers.
All right, final question real quick. Ever tested electric actuated wastegates? Wastegates actuated by an electric motor?
We actually made one. Guess it was back in 94, 95. We took an actual AccuFab throttle body and hooked a linear actuator motor to it, and then John wrote code to it, and we used it like a idle air control motor. And surprisingly, it worked really good, but needless to say, a throttle body doesn't hold up very long to the temperatures that we're using to limit exhaust pressure. So as you can imagine, the blade had bent a couple times, but it was something that was necessary for what we were doing at the time. So I could see big things on the horizon if somebody actually gets into that and takes that on as an actual job to do. Our minor attempt at it in the 90s showed big promise.
Excellent. Mike, great job. Thank you so much for spending a little time with Randy and myself. Learned a lot. I know the audience is out there. They're starved for this kind of information, and just love the fact that you're encouraging people who haven't done this to not be afraid to get involved. It's obviously a lot of fun, and there's a lot of reward out there, a lot of power. So congratulations on your career to this point. Thank you for spending time with us here at Engine Performance Expo. What a day, what a day, what a day. Yeah, my brain is swollen. I've learned so much today. They told us, don't start cars. We are not going to listen.